The morning rain fell softly outside, painting the quiet Oregon town in shades of gray. Laura Bennett stood in her bathroom, steam rising around her as the sound of water echoed through the room. It was supposed to be a simple start to another quiet day. But fate had other plans. Laura was 42, graceful and calm. The kind of woman whose presence felt warm, even when she said little. Life had not been kind to her in recent years. 2 years ago, she lost her husband Mark in a car accident. Since then, she'd learned to live with silence, the kind that fills a house and lingers even after the lights go out. Her stepson, Evan, had been away at college for most of that time. He was 22 now, studying architecture in Seattle. After graduation, he'd asked if he could move back home for a while before starting his job search. She had said yes, without thinking. Having him around made the house feel alive again. That morning, Laura's mind wandered as she rinsed her hair. She thought about the grocery list, the laundry, maybe baking later. She didn't notice how slick the floor had become until her foot slid forward. A gasp left her lips as she fell, her shoulder hitting the shower door hard. The sharp pain made her cry out before she could stop herself. "Evan!" She shouted, her voice trembling. "Evan, help!" Downstairs, Evan was eating breakfast when he heard her. His chair scraped the floor as he jumped up and ran upstairs, heart pounding. The bathroom door was half closed, steam pouring out. "Laura," he called, his voice full of panic. "Are you okay?" I slipped," she stammered. "My shoulder. It hurts." Without thinking, Evan pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment his eyes met her, wrapped only in a towel, both froze. His face turned red and he quickly looked away. "I'm sorry. I didn't. He stuttered. "It's okay," she said quickly, clutching the towel tighter. "I just need something to hold on to." He nodded, stepping carefully across the wet tiles. "Here, take my hand," he said softly. She hesitated for a moment, embarrassed, but the pain in her shoulder was too much. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they met his. Evan helped her stand, steady and gentle. His grip was firm, his eyes never daring to look at her directly. "You're okay now," he murmured. Her breath came unevenly, half from the pain, half from the closeness. She hadn't been this near to anyone in a long time. The smell of his cologne, the warmth of his hand, it all felt strangely comforting, almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said in a small voice. He grabbed a dry towel and wrapped it around her shoulder to support it. "You might have bruised it," he said. "We should ice it." "I'll be fine," she tried to say, but her voice trembled. Evan frowned slightly. "Let me help, please." He guided her to the bedroom, keeping his back turned most of the time, giving her every bit of space he could. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady her breath. Her heart was still racing, as he went to get the first aid kit. Laura looked at the empty doorway and let out a shaky laugh. What just happened? She whispered to herself. When Evan returned, he had an ice pack wrapped in a towel. He handed it to her carefully. "Here, hold this against your shoulder." "Thank you," she said, avoiding his eyes. The silence between them was thick. Not awkward, but charged with something neither could name. She wanted to tell him not to worry, to laugh it off. But she couldn't. She saw the worry in his eyes, real, honest, deep. "I should have been more careful," she muttered. He shook his head. "Don't say that. It could happen to anyone." For a moment, she studied him. He wasn't a boy anymore. Somewhere between the years of college and responsibility, he had become a man, taller, calmer, more confident. The realization caught her off guard. Evan broke the silence. "Do you need to see a doctor?" "No, it's just a bruise," she said softly. "I'll be fine after some rest." He hesitated, then smiled gently. "Okay, but promise me you'll call if it gets worse." "I promise." He nodded and stood there for a moment, unsure what else to say. The sound of rain filled the space between them again. Finally, he turned to leave as the door closed behind him. Laura sat quietly, holding the ice pack against her shoulder. Her reflection in the mirror across the room looked different, flushed, confused, alive. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her the way Evan had. Not with desire, but with genuine concern. That night, As she lay in bed, the image of his worried face kept returning to her mind. She told herself it was nothing, just motherly affection mixed with gratitude. But deep down, she felt something shift a tiny crack in the walls she'd built around her heart. Evan, on the other hand, couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head either. He hadn't meant to see her like that. It was an accident, but he couldn't deny the shock of realizing how fragile and human she was. To him, she had always been strong, graceful, untouchable. Seeing her hurt stirred something protective in him, something that felt new and confusing. At dinner that evening, the silence between them was almost delicate. Laura cooked while Evan set the table, their words few and careful. When their eyes met across the table, they both looked away quickly. "How's your shoulder?" he finally asked. "It's much better," she said with a faint smile. "Thank you again for helping me." He nodded, his expression soft. "Any time." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. After dinner, Evan went upstairs while Laura stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly. The warm water on her hands couldn't wash away the thought that something had changed between them. Not in a wrong way, but in a way that made her heart remember what care felt like. That night, rain continued to fall outside. Laura sat by her bedroom window, listening to it, her arm still sore, but her heart oddly restless. She thought about Mark, about the life she'd lost, and the quiet presence of Evan, who somehow made the house feel full again. She didn't know what the next day would bring. She only knew that something small yet undeniable had begun, a moment born from an accident that neither of them would ever forget. And as the rain kept falling, Laura whispered to herself, maybe some accidents aren't meant to break us. Maybe they're meant to wake us up. The days after the accident passed quietly, but something invisible had changed inside the Bennett house. The air carried a new kind of silence, not cold or empty like before, but heavy with thoughts. Neither of them dared to speak. Laura tried to convince herself that everything was normal. She told herself Evan had only helped her because he was kind and caring like his father. But every time she saw him moving around the house, his calm presence, the way he smiled shyly when their eyes met, she felt her heart stir in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her shoulder healed faster than expected. Evan made sure she didn't lift heavy things and reminded her to ice it at night. He'd leave small notes on the kitchen counter. "Don't forget your tea." "Rest your arm," thoughtful gestures that warmed her heart more than she wanted to admit. One evening, as she folded laundry, she heard his laughter from the living room. He was on a video call with an old college friend. That easy, carefree laugh made her smile. For so long, the house had been silent. Now there was life again. Music, laughter, the sound of footsteps that weren't hers alone. But with that comfort came confusion. Laura found herself noticing things she shouldn't. How gentle his voice sounded when he spoke. How kind his eyes were when he looked at her. She scolded herself quietly, pushing those thoughts away. He was family, even if not by blood. He was her late husband's son. Still, every time she tried to ignore it, her heart refused to listen. The following Saturday, Evan offered to help clean out the garden shed. It was a small space filled with old boxes, tools, and memories Laura hadn't touched since Mark's death. As they worked side by side, she noticed how patient he was, how he asked before touching things, how careful he was with every memory she chose to keep or throw away. "Your dad used to spend hours here," she said softly, brushing dust off a box of old tools. "I remember," Evan replied, handing her a rag. "He'd build birdhouses for you. I helped once, though mine fell apart." Laura smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "He loved having you around. You made him proud." Evan looked at her for a long moment, his expression gentle. "He loved you more than anything. You know that, right?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "I know. Sometimes it still feels like he's just out there working in the yard. I keep expecting to hear his whistle." Evan placed a hand on her good shoulder, a comforting gesture, nothing more, but it sent a soft shiver through her. "You don't have to go through all this alone," he said quietly. "I've been alone for a long time," she admitted. "I guess I just got used to it." Evan's voice was steady. almost protective. You don't have to be anymore. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, time stopped. The sunlight filtered through the dusty window, painting his face in gold. She looked away quickly, afraid of what he might see in her expression. That evening, the house felt smaller, warmer. Evan cooked dinner, pasta and garlic bread, insisting that she rest her shoulder. Laura sat at the table, watching him move around the kitchen like he belonged there. And maybe he did. When he placed the plate in front of her, she said softly, "You're spoiling me. You know that." He chuckled. "Someone has to. You work too hard." They ate quietly, the sound of rain starting outside again. Every now and then, their eyes met, and neither could look away right away. There was no plan, no reason, just a strange comfort in each other's company. After dinner, they sat on the porch, wrapped in soft blankets, watching the rain fall. The garden glowed under the porch light, the air filled with the smell of wet grass. "It's funny," Evan said after a long silence. "I used to hate the rain, but now it reminds me of home." Laura smiled faintly. "It reminds me of Mark. He used to say the rain made everything clean again." "Maybe it does," Evan murmured. "The sound of rain." Their quiet voices and the closeness between them created a peace neither had felt in a long time. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was deeper, a kind of understanding that happens when two lonely souls recognize the same pain in each other. But that connection was dangerous too, because it made them feel alive again. Later that night, Laura couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. In the reflection, she saw herself a woman who had survived grief, who had rebuilt her life, yet here she was, her heart fluttering like a teenager's. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself. "He's family." But her mind reminded her of the truth. Evan wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't her blood. He was a grown man who cared for her when no one else did. Down the hall, Evan was awake too. He sat at his desk, sketching a design for a small house project he was working on. But every few minutes, his thoughts drifted. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about how fragile she'd looked when she fell, about how strong she still was despite everything she'd been through. He admired her not in a childish way, but with deep respect. She'd raised him not as a strict stepmother, but as someone who quietly stood by him when life was hard. And lately he realized how much he didn't want to lose that presence. He told himself it was gratitude, affection, nothing more. But the ache in his chest said otherwise. The next morning, they met in the kitchen at the same time, both surprised, couldn't sleep. She asked softly. He smiled. "Too much on my mind." "Same here," she admitted. They stood there for a moment, both pretending not to notice how close they were. Then Laura reached for her coffee, her hand brushing his lightly. It was a simple touch, innocent, but it sent a rush of warmth through both of them. Neither said anything. The only sound was the quiet hum of the coffee machine and the soft patter of rain against the windows. That morning, something new settled between them. Not spoken, not confessed, but real. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning of something they both felt and neither understood. As Evan left for a short drive to clear his head, Laura stood by the window, watching him go. She didn't know where this path was leading, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The distance that used to separate them was gone. In its place was something tender, something uncertain, something that made her heart beat again. And as the rain slowed outside, Laura whispered to herself, maybe what's broken doesn't always stay that way. Maybe sometimes it just changes shape. The days grew shorter, and the Oregon air carried the crisp scent of autumn. The trees turned gold, and the evenings came earlier, wrapping the Bennett house in soft orange light. For Laura, life began to move in slow, gentle rhythms again. She cooked, worked from home, and found small reasons to smile. But behind every quiet moment, there was Evan and the strange new warmth his presence brought. Since the accident, they'd become closer in small ways. Morning coffee together, shared meals, long talks by the fireplace that stretched into the night. They didn't talk about feelings, but they didn't need to. It was there in every glance, in every word left unsaid. Laura tried to ignore it. She told herself she was just lonely, that she missed Mark, and that Evan's kindness only reminded her of the love she had lost. But late at night, when she sat alone with a cup of tea, she couldn't silence the truth. Evan made her feel seen again. And that terrified her. Evan, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. He admired her strength, her calm, the quiet way she moved through life with grace. But what he felt wasn't simple. It wasn't something he could name or talk about. He only knew that when she smiled, the room felt brighter one evening. While cleaning the attic, Laura found a dusty box of old photos. She carried it downstairs and called Evan to help. They sat together on the floor of the living room, flipping through memories marks, camping trips, birthdays, family gatherings. The warmth of the fireplace filled the room. "Wow," Evan said softly, picking up a wedding photo. "You two looked happy." Laura smiled faintly. "We were. He was my calm in every storm." Evan's voice softened. "He was lucky to have you." She looked up at him, surprised. "You really think so?" "I know so," he said, eyes steady. "You made this house a home. Even after he passed, you kept everything together. Most people would have fallen apart." His words hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't heard anything like that in years. "I didn't feel strong," she admitted. "I just survived." Evan leaned closer, his tone gentle. "Sometimes surviving is the bravest thing you can do." The fire crackled. The air between them grew still. She looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, not pity. For the first time, didn't feel like a widow or a caretaker. She felt like herself. She turned back to the photo box to break the tension. "Here's one of you," she said, handing him a picture. It was of him as a teenager, holding a fishing rod with Mark by his side. Evan smiled at the memory. "He taught me everything. I still remember how proud he looked when I caught my first fish." "He adored you," she said quietly. "He used to say you had his patience and my heart." Evan looked at her, his expression softening. "I hope that's true." Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. It wasn't a planned moment, it just happened. And in that silence, something passed between them. A quiet understanding. A feeling too deep for words. Laura was the first to move. She stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "We should probably put these away before we ruin them." Her voice trembled slightly. Evan nodded, helping her gather the photos. But the look on his face lingered, part confusion, part longing. That night, after he went to his room, Laura sat by the window again. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. She could still feel the echo of that moment, the way his voice softened, the look in his eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "This can't happen. It's wrong." But even as she said it, a small part of her heart whispered something else. "It's real." The next morning, she tried to distance herself. She woke early, went for a walk, and buried herself in work. But Evan noticed. He saw the way she avoided eye contact, how her laughter had quieted. He didn't say anything until one evening when he found her sitting alone on the porch, staring at the falling leaves. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. Sitting beside her, "I've just been tired," she replied. Keeping her gaze on the horizon, he hesitated. "Did I do something?" She turned to him, startled. "No, of course not." He sighed. "Because if I did, I want to fix it." Her heart twisted. "You didn't do anything wrong, Evan. Sometimes things get complicated." He looked at her closely. Complicated how? She couldn't find the right words. The truth sat on her tongue but refused to leave. She wanted to say that being near him made her heart ache and heal at the same time, that she was afraid of what she felt. But instead, she whispered, "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," he said softly. Laura looked at him, really looked, and saw the same storm in his eyes that lived in hers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You remind me of him. And sometimes that makes it hard to breathe." Evan's expression softened with understanding. Laura, I don't want to replace him. I just want to be here for you. His words were simple but full of meaning. The sincerity in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him to stop, to step back, to leave before emotions grew deeper. But she couldn't because a part of her didn't want him to. Instead, she smiled faintly, tears shining in her eyes. "You already are," she whispered. They sat in silence, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. It was a quiet moment, filled with unspoken words. She didn't know what the future held, but in that instant, she felt something shift again, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. That night when Evan went to bed, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. "You already are." They replayed in his mind over and over, a sentence that felt both comforting and dangerous. He stood by his window, looking out at the same stars she was staring at across the hall. Somewhere in the middle of grief and healing, something new had begun to grow between them, something fragile. Forbidden by circumstance, but pure in feeling. Neither of them said it out loud. They couldn't. But they both knew sometimes love doesn't arrive like thunder. It sneaks in quietly, through kindness, through care, through moments that feel too small to matter until suddenly they do. And as autumn deepened outside, the unspoken confession hung between them, soft, uncertain, but real. The first snow fell early that year, covering the quiet Oregon neighborhood in a soft white blanket. The air smelled of pine and firewood. For Laura, it felt like the world was pausing, holding its breath, waiting for something to change. It had been weeks since that evening on the porch, when she and Evan shared words that hung between them like a secret. Since then, neither had spoken about it. But everything between them felt different, softer. He moved around the house with quiet care, always looking out for her, and she found herself watching him without meaning to. Each morning began the same. He brewed coffee. She cooked breakfast. Their conversations were short, gentle about the weather, errands, or his job applications. Yet beneath those ordinary words lived something unspoken, something fragile. One morning, Laura found Evan sitting by the window, sketchbook in hand. The light from the snow reflected on his face. "You're up early," she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "The quiet feels louder lately." She handed him a cup, smiling faintly. "It does that sometimes." He flipped the page in his sketchbook and turned it toward her. "I was working on this." Was a drawing of their backyard, the same view they'd shared on rainy nights. The trees, the garden, even the small shed where Mark used to work. Every detail was captured with warmth. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I was thinking," he continued, "maybe we could fix up the shed next spring. Make it into a little studio for you." She blinked, surprised. "For me?" He nodded. "You always talk about wanting a quiet space to design, to paint. You deserve that." Her throat tightened. For years, no one had thought about what she needed. "That's really kind, Evan." He smiled. "It's not kindness. It's just something I want to do." Something stirred in her chest again, that same warmth she'd tried to ignore for weeks. She looked at him, really looked, and realized how much he'd grown. He wasn't the boy who once needed her guidance. He was a man who understood her silence better than anyone else. Later that day, the snow turned to rain. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping on the roof. Laura sat by the fireplace, lost in thought. Evan walked in quietly, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "Thought you might like this," he said. She smiled. "You're spoiling me again? Maybe you need it." They sat in front of the fire, the light flickering across their faces. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows, bringing with it memories of the accident, the porch talks, the laughter they'd shared through quiet evenings. After a while, Laura said, "You've been good to me, Evan, more than I probably deserve." He frowned slightly. "You don't have to say that. You've been good to me too. This house, it's saved me in ways I can't explain." She tilted her head. "Saved you?" He nodded slowly. "After Dad passed, I didn't know who I was anymore. I was angry, lost. Coming back here, it felt like coming home again. You made it feel safe. Her heart ached. Evan. He met her eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence. He looked at her the way one might look at something they didn't want to lose, carefully, almost reverently. "I don't know what happens next," he said finally, "but I just want you to know you're not alone. You'll never be." The words sank deep. Laura looked away, afraid of how much they meant to her. She wasn't sure when their bond had crossed that invisible line between care and affection. All she knew was that it had quietly, naturally, like the rain that fell without warning. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about Mark, about love, loss, and the strange way life stitched broken hearts together again. Maybe love didn't always come once. Maybe sometimes it returned in another form, unexpected, but real. The next morning, the rain hadn't stopped. Laura woke up early and made pancakes. She was humming softly when Evan walked into the kitchen. His hair messy, his eyes sleepy. "You're in a good mood," he said, smiling. "Maybe I just realized something," she replied, flipping a pancake. "What's that?" "That life doesn't stop after loss. It just changes shape." He smiled at her words, though she could tell he wanted to ask what she meant. She didn't explain. Some feelings didn't need words. They ate breakfast together while the rain kept falling. It was quiet, peaceful, almost like the world outside didn't exist. Later that afternoon, Laura stood by the garden door, watching the water drip from the roof. The yard looked alive again, the earth breathing after months of stillness. Evan joined her, standing close, but not too close. "It's funny," she said softly. "The rain started the day everything changed. And here it is again." "Maybe it's trying to remind us," he said. "Remind us of what?" "That some storms don't destroy things. They just make room for new ones to grow." She turned toward him, her chest tightening. His words were simple but full of meaning. She wanted to tell him how much he'd healed her without even realizing it, how his presence had turned her grief into quiet hope. But all she said was, "You've grown up, Evan." He laughed softly. "I had a good teacher." That night, the two of them lit the fireplace again. The rain outside had become heavier, drumming softly on the roof. Laura leaned back on the couch, feeling calm for the first time in years. Evan sat across from her, sketching idly. The room filled with the warmth of flickering light. When their eyes met across the flames, there was no confusion this time. No guilt, just understanding. A quiet bond built on care, on shared pain. On the courage to keep going. Laura realized then that love didn't always come with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it arrived softly in kindness, in laughter. In the way someone stayed when everyone else had gone. She smiled and Evan smiled back. No words were needed. Outside, the rain kept falling, the same rain that had started everything months ago. But this time, it didn't feel like an accident or a storm. It felt like renewal. As the clock ticked past midnight, Laura whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what healing looks like." And in that small, quiet home, surrounded by the sound of rain and the warmth of shared hearts, healing truly began, not with promises or confessions, but with peace. Because sometimes love doesn't ask for names or labels. It just asks to be felt. And that was enough.